So, the Clone Wars started with the Battle of Geonosis that saw Separatist and Republic forces facing off on the desert world of Geonosis. But then the next battle we really know a lot about is the Battle of Christophsis, which is nearly a month later. So, what was that first month of the Clone Wars like, and why didn't we see a ton of action during the very opening phases of one of the largest wars the galaxy has ever seen? Well, today let's dive into that brief period of the Clone Wars and talk about what it was like immediately after the Battle of Geonosis. I'm Colin, and this is Sci-Fi Deep Dive. Remember, if you enjoyed this video, to head down below and hit that subscribe button. So before we dive into this, I'm going to throw out there that a good portion of this video is speculation. It's kind of a gap in the canon, and when we know little bits and pieces here and there, the parts are a little bit harder to piece together, and a lot of the specifics are kind of muddied by the fact that it's a gap that, quite frankly, no one has a lot of interest in filling. So I'm going to draw some connections here and hope that I'm as close to accurate as I can be. So let's start with the general feeling around the galaxy. The Battle of Geonosis was shocking to both sides. The Republic had some knowledge that a large Separatist military presence was being built and that the Separatist crisis was about to boil over into a large civil war. They didn't quite understand just how large the army that the Confederacy was building actually was, so they didn't really realize the threat the CIS posed until they were on the ground on Geonosis and saw the droid army in combat firsthand, which is understandable. Meanwhile, the Separatists had no idea, with the exception of a handful of members, obviously, had no idea that the Republic had a massive army. So the appearance of the clone army caught them completely off guard. Both sides probably thought that whatever happened on Geonosis would be a clean sweep, and the situation would basically be resolved either on Geonosis or shortly thereafter with the destruction of their adversaries. The Republic thinking that the clone army could wipe through whatever droid security forces were there and push into Separatist territory and lock things down, and the Separatists thinking that they were going to approach the Republic with a massive army and the Republic would likely just roll over and surrender. And both sides were surprised by the massive battle that ensued that ravaged Geonosis. Both sides kind of pulled back and had a moment like just recovering from that shock of a massive military engagement that neither side really expected to take part in, but both sides saw happen firsthand. Now, the first of these two sides of this conflict to sort of get back on their feet and start moving were the Separatists. We do know that the Separatists quickly began moving to try to secure a foothold in the Outer Rim. This meant taking worlds that were loyal to the Separatists and formally offering them a position within a newly formed Separatist parliament, and sort of building a territorial domain for the Confederacy of Independent Systems. And the Republic, which sought to prevent this, started moving into the Outer Rim to counter that. Now, it's likely in these early days that the clone army took some time to disseminate around the galaxy. After all, on the eve of the Battle of Geonosis, they were entirely concentrated on a single world, the world of Camino, with relatively limited transportation infrastructure. It was a massive feat that they were able to move this army from Camino to Geonosis to take part in that battle at all. So distributing them around the galaxy before the Separatists could grab a foothold must have been a real challenge, and I think that's why we don't see a lot of battles for that first month of the war. In reality, the Separatists had a pretty big advantage for that first month of the war. They had a massive army ready to go for months, and were planning at least some sort of territorial expansion. Meanwhile, the Republic and the clone army kind of sprung on them on the eve of the war, and didn't have the infrastructure to move them around right away. So that first month in general could be characterized by the Republic setting up the infrastructure needed to move an army, and the Separatists trying to sort of shore up their defenses in their corner of the galaxy before they started pushing outwards. And it's kind of exactly what they did. A lot of the planets that we saw battles carried out later on in the conflict were captured by the Separatists in this phase. One of the most notable ones that come to mind is Ryloth, which was snatched by Separatist forces fairly early on in the conflict, a little bit after the Battle of Christophsis, but still right around that period of time when both sides are still trying to get their foothold in a new galactic landscape centered around a conflict that neither side really wanted to or expected to fight. So that's why we don't see any major battles through this period of the war. Like I said, both sides were busy with one thing or another. But what about for the average citizen of the Republic or of the newly formed separatist territories? Well, the opinions might have been very different based on which side of that border you lied on. On the Republic side, it was likely shock and concern. There was this great fear that the separatists would still sweep through the galaxy and just push whatever resistance the Republic had aside and strike at the galactic core and gain their own independence, or usurp the Republic as a whole. Meanwhile, within the separatist territory, there was likely almost a jovial civilian mentality. They had just declared their independence from the Republic. They had a large standing military that at that time, even if the Republic did manage to muster a few 100,000 clones, they had a gargantuan army of battle droids that they believed could overwhelm any Republic resistance. So it still seemed like they were on the verge of gaining everything they wanted in any potential conflict. It reminds me a lot of the early days of World War I, where all sides thought the war would be over by Christmas. It would be a quick, brief, fast war where their side would grab the objectives they wanted and would be waving the flag of victory within 5 months. Both sides of the Clone Wars kind of had this idea that they were going to sweep victory quickly. The Republic thinking that they would be able to move in and stamp out the formation of a separatist state before it could actually take root, and the Separatists believing that they had an army that would dwarf and overpower anything the Republic could bring to the table, even after knowing that the clones were a present threat. It really wouldn't be until the Battle of Christophsis that I think both sides really realized just how long and brutal this war could be, because Christophsis ended up as a stalemate and then ultimately ended in a Republic victory. By the time of the Battle of Christophsis, it was clear to both sides that that wouldn't be the case. For the Republic, it was clear that the Separatists had gained a proper territory that was now pretty well defended. So the hope of sweeping in and stamping out Separatist uprisings one by one, like bouts of civil unrest, it was kind of out the window. They were now going to have to fight a conventional war. And for the Separatists, it was clear that the clones were not a one-off fluke of the Battle of Geonosis, but instead an incredibly competent fighting force that could reasonably stand against a much larger droid force and expect a victory. At the end of the day, that wake-up call, though, was the beginning of the setting of the battle lines of the Clone Wars that, while they did move a bit throughout the conflict, stayed relatively static. The Separatists would make a few incursions into the mid-rim, or a handful of incursions into the core, but at the end of the day, most of the battles were around where these battle lines were drawn in the very early days of the war, while both sides tried to grab what territory they could. But there's a lot to be said specifically about the Confederacy of Independent Systems, a faction that often gets overlooked because of their sort of heavy ties to corporations. If you'd like to learn more about the civilian side of the CIS, and really what motivated the Separatists to want to leave the Republic, what led to what would be called the Separatist Crisis, I'll leave a link up here to my video on that. And I'd like you to let me know down in the comments whether you think I'm right about my assessment that both sides were just sort of catching their breath after the shock of Geonosis. Do you think there really were battles in there that were as massive as the battles in the rest of the war and we just haven't seen them yet? Or do you think those battles, or those days, were really quiet? And if you have anything else you'd like to see me cover in Star Wars or anywhere else in science fiction, you can let me know down below in the comments. Last but not least, if you enjoyed this video, head down below, hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the bell icon so you get notified when I upload new videos. So for Sci-Fi Deep Dive, I'm Colin, and I will see you next time.